In this section of the course, we're making a kind of major transition from the kind of writing we've been doing so far this semester, which have been basically public in nature, writing to public audiences, towards a different kind of writing, the kind of writing that's most commonly taught at the college level, which is academic writing, or writing to an academic audience. Which means that we're going to have to talk a little bit about academic style, or how you write to an academic audience. Now, I'm kind of reluctant to even start talking about it because academic style, in my opinion, my experience, is one of the biggest obstacles for freshman writers specifically, or beginning academic writers. And I don't think that the reason that academic style presents such an obstacle is because it's so difficult, but rather because it's so misunderstood. Students often see academic style, or academic writing in general, as a set of arbitrary rules that English teachers have given them over the years. Don't use first-person pronouns like I or me. Don't use contractions, or don't begin a sentence with and or but, or those kinds of things. And I can't really blame the students for thinking that that's what academic style is all about, because that's what a lot of English teachers, maybe especially high school English teachers, focus on when they teach academic writing. But that's not really what academic style is all about. There are certainly some conventions of academic writing that we'll have to talk about, and I do think they're conventions, not rules. But really, to understand academic writing, I think it pays to think more about the audience that you're writing to, in ways that we've already been talking about throughout the semester. And we focused on audience awareness and discourse communities, especially in the public argument unit of the class. And I think that if we take those ideas and apply them to academic writing, academic style becomes a lot easier to understand. Most of the characteristics of academic style that you've been taught and that we're going to talk about today have to do with what we know about the academic audience and our relationship with the academic audience. So rather than looking at individual rules or conventions, let's talk about some general characteristics about academic writing and why academic writing is that way. First of all, and this is what most students think of when they think about academic writing in my experience, academic writing tends to be formal. Or rather, it tends not to be informal. And I'll talk about that distinction a little more in just a minute. But this is what I think students think of as academic writing, a very formal, maybe what my wife sometimes calls fancy writing, lots of big words and complex sentence structure and things like that. But I think that thinking about academic writing and thinking about the formality aspect of academic writing in that way is a little misguided. Really, the formality that's so common in academic writing has to do with audience familiarity, or more specifically, a lack of audience familiarity. Think about it this way. When you wrote your public argument papers, you were able to base some of your stylistic choices, word choice and sentence structure and things like that, on what you knew about the audience. If you were writing to your coworkers, you could write the way your coworkers talk or think. If you were writing to people in your community, you could make certain assumptions about words and phrases that people in your community would use or be comfortable with. But the thing about an academic audience is we don't know much about that audience. We're not familiar with the audience. They're not people that we have a relationship with. And as a result, we can't make many assumptions about what kinds of language that audience would use. So, for example, we can't make assumptions about things like slang, because slang, by definition, is sort of limited to specific audiences. There are terms, words, phrases that you might use with people of your same age that you wouldn't necessarily use with your grandparents, for example, or with people your grandparents' age, more specifically. But since we don't know the age of the people we're writing to when we write an academic paper, it's very difficult to make any assumptions about what kinds of words or phrases they'd be comfortable with. But it's not just age. We don't know their ethnic background. We don't know their geographical location. You're not just writing to an American audience, for example, when you write academically, because the academic world is international. People in other parts of the world will engage in academic writing and share academic writing. So you can't make any assumptions about who the people you're writing to are, and as a result, you kind of have to write in a fairly neutral way. You have to avoid any kind of language that is sort of based on particular age, gender, ethnicity, cultural assumptions. But as I said a minute ago, I think maybe instead of thinking about academic writing as being formal, maybe it's more productive to think about it as not being informal. In other words, rather than sort of striving to make your writing sound more formal, the easiest way to achieve formality, the kind of formality that's appropriate for an academic audience, is just to avoid any kind of informal writing. Obviously avoid, as I said, slang words or abbreviations or just sort of conversational writing, beginning sentences with well, like, well, this is a really important idea. That's more of a Southern conversational technique. You don't see people use that in other parts of the country and certainly not in other parts of the world. So if you avoid using that kind of technique, that kind of strategy, then you avoid making assumptions about who your audience is. So in general, avoid any kind of informal writing and formal words and formal phrasing, but don't go out of your way to make your writing sound more formal. Certainly don't approach academic writing, as I said a minute ago, as an exercise in using big words and complicated sentence structure. Always aim for clarity over all other things. In other words, use the best word, not the biggest word. Use the clearest sentence structure, not the most complicated sentence structure. Now, related to the formality of academic writing is another characteristic which, again, I think most students are familiar with. They've been taught this before. Academic writing tends to be impersonal. Now, this is what your teachers, especially your high school teachers, were talking about when they told you not to use first-person pronouns, right? Not to use I or me in your paper. The idea is that academic writing should be about the subject matter that you're writing about, not about you. But again, this goes back to the relationship we have with the academic audience. When you were writing your public argument, you were writing to people who do know you, or at least you might have been writing to people who do know you. Some people do write to their workplace or to their church or their community in some other way. I've had students actually write public arguments to their family. And when you write to that kind of audience, well, the people then that you're writing to, your audience, does care about you on some level, and so you can talk about yourself. But in academic writing, because you're not writing to an audience that you have a relationship with, you should generally avoid talking about yourself. And again, that means avoid using first-person pronouns. Avoid using I, me, and my opinion. The fact that it's your opinion doesn't really matter to the audience. What they want to know is what your opinion is, not the fact of it being yours. Also, by the way, first-person plural pronouns, words like we and us and our, these are in some ways even more dangerous to use than the first-person singular pronouns, because when you say we, like we need to make this change, you're making assumptions about the group that your audience belongs to. You're putting yourself in the same group with them. And especially if you're talking about an issue that is specific to, let's say, American political culture. If you want to say, we need to pass this law, well, some of the people that you're writing to may not be Americans, as I said a minute ago. So you want to avoid using words like we and us and our because they're almost too inclusive. They make assumptions about the relationship between you and the audience that aren't necessarily valid. You also want to avoid second-person pronouns. In other words, you want to avoid using words like you and your, which really boils down to not addressing the audience directly. And this is, again, sort of a convention of academic writing. Because you don't know the audience, avoid talking to them directly. In other words, talk about the subject matter in general in an impersonal way, rather than saying something like, have you ever wondered why we, and going on like that. Now, those two characteristics of academic writing, the fact that it's formal and the fact that it's impersonal, those tend to get the most kind of press with teachers especially and with students. But there are a couple of other characteristics that I think we need to pay attention to as well. Academic writing, in addition to being generally formal and impersonal, is also marked for being very careful. And what I mean by careful is that academics place a very high value on accuracy and on correctness. That means that you need to make sure the information you provide when you're writing in an academic context is accurate, comes from a high-quality source. And we'll talk more about the credibility of sources later when we start using source material, but it certainly plays a role here. It also means that you need to be precise. You want to avoid any kind of vagueness in your writing. You don't want to say something like, no kids like to eat their vegetables in academic writing, because, of course, some kids do. You also, by the way, want to avoid a word like kids, which is another example of informal writing. The bottom line is that you want to try to be as precise as you can. Don't make generalizations, don't make vague statements, but rather aim for precision, accuracy, and carefulness. By the way, academic audiences also care more about the correctness of your writing. In other words, grammatical correctness, spelling words correctly, using correct sentence structure, or rather accepted grammatical sentence structure. These things I've let you slide a little bit more on in the first two papers. I've marked them, obviously, when I've graded the papers, but they haven't played a large role in my assessment of your writing, because with some exceptions, you can get away with more grammatical looseness and a few little minor misspellings when you're writing either a narrative to a general audience or to a public audience. After all, if you don't know that a particular sentence structure might be flawed and you're writing to an audience of your peers, then it's likely they won't know either. So it doesn't play as large a role in public writing. But in academic writing, for good or bad, and I know this may sort of reinforce some of your preconceptions about the academic audience, but they do tend to care more about correctness, spelling words correctly, etc. For one thing, there's an issue of credibility involved. Since they don't know you personally, you have to establish your credibility as someone they should listen to. And if you can't spell your words correctly, and if you don't know the difference between a complete sentence and an incomplete sentence, that's harder to do. It's harder to establish that kind of credibility. Finally, academic writing tends to be more thorough than other kinds of writing. And this again goes back to the audience. One of the key differences between an academic audience and sort of a general purpose audience is that academics care more about the details of ideas and issues. An academic audience, by definition, is people who study things. I should have maybe introduced this idea earlier, but academic, in the word academic style or academic writing, really means related to, well, it actually means related to colleges, but we often think of it as related to education in some way. So you're talking about scholars, teachers, students, etc. These are the people that make up an academic audience. And it's not surprising then that they care more about sort of the details of ideas and issues than people outside the academic field would. You can see this in the kind of writing that's actually produced for general audiences and for academic audiences. If you get a general audience magazine, for example, at the grocery store or at the bookstore, you'll find that most of the articles are very short, a page, 2 pages. Some of the longer articles are maybe 5 or 6 pages long. But if you were to find an academic periodical, there's no such thing really as an academic magazine, but there are academic journals, which are kind of like magazines for academics. The articles in academic journals average more like 25 to 30 pages. It's very uncommon to find an article of fewer than 10 pages, for example, whereas it's very uncommon to find an article of more than 10 pages in a general audience magazine. And this has to do with the kind of interest that the audience takes in the subject. Now, what that means for you doesn't mean that you have to write 30-page papers. It does mean that you have to make sure you treat your subject thoroughly and not superficially. You don't want to just sort of brush across the top of the issue when you're writing to an academic audience. You really need to get into it. You need to think about it carefully. You need to make sure you've considered all of the ideas in the paper in a careful, analytical way. This, by the way, is why teachers, or one of the reasons why, teachers give you length guidelines for writing assignments in school, because they want to push you to be more thorough. Whereas in real-world writing for general-purpose audiences, often the goal is to write as briefly as possible. You only have 1,000 words to write this, to cover this idea. In academic writing, often, well, I wouldn't say the point is to write as long as you can, but again, to write thoroughly, to cover the issue in a sufficient amount of detail. Now, if you sort of learn these 4 characteristics, and more importantly, if you learn to think about why these characteristics are the way they are, if you learn to make your writing more formal, or rather to avoid informality because you don't have a relationship with the audience, if you learn to make your writing more impersonal because the audience doesn't care about you personally, and again, because you don't have that relationship, If you learn to make your writing more careful, because you know that an academic audience has a higher standard for accuracy, for precision, and for careful writing. And if you learn to make your writing more thorough, because you know that an academic audience cares more about the details of an issue and not just the generalities, not just the soundbite. If you follow those 4 characteristics, then you're more likely to write successful academic writing. And more importantly, you might not hate writing in an academic style nearly as much as you do if you think of it as just a collection of rules, a collection of don't do this, thou shalt nots, etc. If you do need more specific guidelines, you can look at that document I've posted, which is called some general tips for academic writing, which is sort of a list of rules. But I think that list is sort of secondary to these general characteristics. But you can look at that for some specific guidelines if you want. This is important, when you go to write your academic writing exercise, where I'm going to give you a paragraph and ask you to make it more academic, these are the 4 areas you should focus on. Try to make it more formal, try to make it more impersonal, try to make it more careful, that means more precise, less vague, more accurate, etc. And try to make it more thorough, or rather, places where it might be too superficial, try to increase the thoroughness, or at least increase the coverage of the ideas. Those are the things you need to work on that particular assignment, and also on the last 2 major papers for the class. If you have any questions about academic writing, let me know. Thank you.